Wonderful, thank you, Annie. So now getting into our little bit longer presentations. They're going to be about 10 minutes each. We're starting off with Christian Colo.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Colo. I'm a master's student in the TCBES program here. When I was getting started for this presentation and getting ready for it, I was thinking back to when we first started the program. And one of the questions that everyone always asks each other is, are you terrestrial or are you marine? And I know, do you do land stuff or do you do ocean stuff? And I've always loved both. So I'm really glad to be talking about this topic today, about linking the land and the sea together and exploring the connectivity between them. So kind of the overarching question is, why are nutrients important? Why is it important to study them? So nitrogen and phosphorus, the nutrients that are a part of this study, they're kind of some of the fundamental building blocks of life. They're the things that primary producers on land and at sea use to form the foundation of the food web. So changes to these nitrogen and phosphorus pools can affect ecosystems and communities. Since the pre-industrial era, humans have more than doubled nitrogen and phosphorus export to the coastal zone, and a lot of that export happens via rivers. And this has a lot of implications for downstream ecosystems and human health. Things like eutrophication, harmful algal blooms, there can be impacts on fisheries and impacts on food webs. Hypoxia, water quality can be changed, and these things can lead to bacterial proliferation in some cases. So changes to these N and P pools can have significant implications. So to address nitrogen and phosphorus and nutrients in general, you kind of have to address it at the watershed scale and look at all the contributing factors. So the watershed for this study is the Wailuku River watershed here in Hawaii. It basically connects Mauna Loa, Mauna Kea, all the way to Hilo and drains out into Hilo Bay. It's a very steep and porous watershed relatively, so it has a lot of connectivity between land and sea. It's primarily forest and agriculture, and as we all know, there's the rainy season and the dry season, so there's kind of a regular oscillation in these nutrient fluxes, or we would expect there to be. Kind of looking at different areas of the watershed in terms of things that might be contributing to nutrient fluxes in the rivers. In the lower watershed, there's been a lot of land use changes. That includes agriculture and urban and suburban development in the greater Hilo area. Relatively high cesspool density, which has shown to contribute nitrogen and phosphorus to the coastal zone. And also an increase in albizia cover. Albizia is an invasive nitrogen fixer, and it's been shown in the Wailuku River to elevate nitrogen levels in the river. Moving up into the middle of the watershed, more of a mixed native forest, mostly koa and ohia. It's a restricted watershed, it's a conservation district, and that's because it provides the groundwater and the freshwater supply for the greater Hilo area. So when you turn on your faucet and drink that beautiful clean water, that's thanks to your intact watershed that's providing that for you. And then in the upper watershed, mostly former pasture lands, mostly dominated by invasive grasses. There's also a large monoculture of gorse, which is another invasive nitrogen fixer. You can kind of see the distribution of it there in the picture. So albizia as a nitrogen fixer has been studied in this watershed, but gorse has never been studied in terms of how it might be contributing to nitrogen or phosphorus pools. So based on those watershed characteristics, that kind of led me to my research questions. So I'm currently in the middle of this thesis research, so kind of only have a preliminary analysis right now. But my main research question is to conduct a nitrogen and phosphorus flux assessment for the watershed. So basically by taking river water samples and drift net samples in the river, I want to figure out what the concentrations, the forms, and the isotopic composition of the nitrogen and phosphorus are. And from there, I'll be able to create nitrogen and phosphorus load estimation models and look at fluxes seasonally, monthly, and annually to see what those total nutrient loads are that are being exported out of the watershed into the coastal environment. The second research question is looking at the sources of those nutrients. So after figuring out what the fluxes are, trying to figure out where in the watershed these nutrients are coming from. So I'm currently conducting watershed sampling, where I'm taking vegetation samples and soil samples, looking at things like livestock manure, wild manure, to kind of look at possible sources of nutrients into the waterways. From there, we'll be able to conduct our analytical analyses and use source partitioning models to eventually, the goal would be to match the isotopic signatures of the source samples in the watershed to the signatures of what we're seeing in the river, to figure out, what is bringing all those nutrients into the river and then eventually out into the bay. And finally, after we've answered those two questions, my goal is to model future nitrogen and phosphorus flux changes using precipitation projections for the island of Hawaii, specific to East Hawaii. And I'll be able to apply those precipitation models to those load estimation models from question 1. So getting into the preliminary results for the study, the phosphorus pools are kind of to be expected. So there are low concentrations of dissolved phosphate, which is pretty typical for Hawaii. But there's also an increase in organic phosphorus during storm flow conditions. Looking at the nitrogen pool, it's pretty interesting, especially when you compare it to an earlier study that was conducted in the watershed, same river, same analyses. And basically what we're seeing is an increase in ammonium across all flow conditions, an increase in dissolved organic nitrogen, a steadier export of particulate nitrogen across all flow conditions, and an overall increase in dissolved nitrogen export. Getting to those sources of nutrients, this is specifically looking at the isotopic composition of nitrates. There is some indication of sewage or manure contamination in the river with these higher isotope values that you see here. The majority of the values, though, it's not as clear right now where these sources might be coming from, but hopefully once I finish those watershed analyses and looking at those potential sources, I'll be better able to figure out and partition out where those sources are coming from. Looking at the particulate organic matter sources, so this is what's getting caught in the drift net in the river samples. Pretty much to be expected. The carbon isotope values are in the standard range for C3 land plants that are found in the watershed. But because of the broad range of nitrogen isotope values, again, once I finish that source sampling, hopefully I'll be able to partition out where some of that particulate matter is coming from. And this aspect of the project I haven't really gotten to yet, but this is projecting future changes to nitrogen and phosphorus. That was that third question. So using projected rainfall changes in Hawaii from this publication right here, that publication looked at future precipitation in both the wet season and the dry season under various climate change scenarios. So I have 6 precipitation models, and basically to sum it all up, it's projected that the wet season will be getting wetter in Hawaii and the dry season will be getting drier. So the bigger disparity between the seasonal precipitation amounts specifically to East Hawaii. So to kind of sum up all of that, again, in terms of nutrient fluxes, seems that there are elevated nitrogen levels across all flow conditions, and that nutrient export dynamics throughout the watershed are changing. In terms of sources, again, there is some indication of sewage or manure in the watershed or in the rivers that's draining the watershed. But again, I'll need some further analysis to kind of figure out where some of those other sources are coming from. And then again, the future of nutrient export in the Wailuku River watershed, that is still to be determined once I get all my analyses done and can apply those precipitation models. And that's it. I would like to thank everyone that's contributed to this project, particularly my committee, Dr. Tracy Wigner, Dr. Stephen Colbert, and Dr. Jason Feldman from the University of Alaska, PICASC for funding the research, my TCBES cohort and the program, and also the UH Hilo Analytical Lab for conducting all of the analyses on the data. Thank you, everybody. Are there any questions? Yes.
Great job, Christian. On the figure or slide when you're comparing your current or at least preliminary results with Dr. Wigner's results from 2009. I was just curious if you think that's representative of general trends in the increases in these nutrients, or given, I mean, my understanding of nutrients in the environment, they can be very ephemeral, they can change very rapidly. So I was curious how you tried to match the timing and the kind of methods that you were using to estimate nitrogen and phosphorus with the methods that were previously used. Like, were you sampling in the same season, same water levels, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the actual sampling site was the same for both studies. And I forget exactly when in the initial study it was. I think it was the data was collected between 2006 and 2007. So over all the seasons over the course of 2 years. And the initial data set for this study was collected between 2021 and 2022, 50 sampling events that kind of encompassed the full range of flow conditions and seasons and temperatures and everything like that. So they're not completely analogous, the two studies, but I think they do, it's somewhat useful to kind of look at the general trends. I think they're relatively well representative of general
So neither
trends.
one were snapshots, they're both longer.
But yeah, very much longer term. I think both of them were 2-year collection periods.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christian, I had a related question. Within those 2 years, is that also capturing variation from storm flow?
Yeah, so in some of those graphs, there were like the two bars next to each other. That was a base flow and storm flow next to each other. So that's one of the main things that I'm looking at, is how these nutrient concentrations and forms change when the river is kind of low and calm, as opposed to when we get these big storm events that rush all of this water out of the watershed. And there are definitely some changes that I'm seeing between the different flow conditions. But in other cases, there's no change between flow conditions. So kind of got to dig deeper into that and figure out why that is.
Are you taking samples from multiple elevational sites along the river, or just one?
It's one site, kind of upper Hilo, above most of the development, most of like the suburbs. But yeah, it's all from one site.
Piggyback on Ren's question, is that site above the collection for water for Hilo, or is it, because I saw you had some signature of manure and fecal matter. I'm just curious, it's basically where is your sampling site and the locations where the water is being brought off for drinking water is my question. I don't know if that makes sense.
I know there's a few wells, in terms of the Hilo water supply, there's a few wells spread out, but there is a well in close proximity to the sampling site.
And upstream or downstream?
That I'm not exactly sure.
It said upstream.
Okay, yes.
So we hope that the water treatment works.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't hear you.
I was wondering what you thought, like, if there should be discussions on limiting resource imports and exports in Hawaii, and if there should be regulations on those things.
What do you mean in terms of resources?
Because like for agriculture, obviously they bring in a lot of fertilizer and not all of it's from Hawaii, so that introduces nutrients into the islands that are otherwise, well, they're normally found here, just probably not as much as we know. But we're also exporting foods and those sort of things.
All right.
So like, we're losing but gaining resources, and I'm wondering if you think there should be more discussions on that.
Yeah, I haven't really, based on the data so far, I haven't been able to see a clear indication of, for example, fertilizer. Once I finish the analyses, I'll be able to see, maybe if there is a very clear indication of that. In the Wailuku River watershed, there's not a ton of agriculture. It's mostly concentrated in the lower region, but I'm not enough of an expert to say whether or not we should be limiting that. But it's definitely something to look at, because that is one of the primary things that leads to downstream eutrophication in other regions in the world. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, everybody.